China has just made a move that will reshape how the world economy works for years to come. And if you are not paying close attention to what is unfolding right now, you might one day find yourself wondering how everything changed so dramatically without anyone breaking it down for you. We are looking at a decision that leaders in the United States have been worried about for a long time. A step that experts in Washington saw coming for years, and now China has finally taken it. It dumped U.S. Treasury bonds in huge quantities. Now, I understand that for a lot of you, this might seem like dry financial talk, like something that only concerns investment professionals on Wall Street or government officials at the Treasury. But let me make this perfectly clear to you. What just took place is far bigger than any recent election, any political statement, or any news story you have come across in the past few months. This is a fundamental change in how global economic power is structured, and the outcomes are going to touch your life, your employment, your money in the bank, and your tomorrow, whether you decide to follow along or not. Let me break down exactly what this is about and why you need to be paying attention. For over 50 years since Richard Nixon walked away from the gold standard in 1971, the United States has functioned under an arrangement that I and many other questioning economists have described as the extraordinary advantage of the dollar. This is not a fair system, and it is not a system based on hard work alone. It is a system rooted in a very significant built-in benefit that lets the United States spend way more than it earns while a large portion of the rest of the world picks up much of the tab. Here is how it functions. The United States creates dollars. Those dollars are welcomed everywhere as the global reserve currency, which means every nation needs dollars to do business with each other, to purchase oil, to build up savings, and to shield themselves during tough times. And because the world requires dollars, the United States can issue this currency without dealing with quick and visible fallout. It is like owning a cash printing machine in your home while all your neighbors agree to take that cash as real payment. No matter how much you print, no matter how reckless you are with your own budget, you can always make more money and someone will take it because everyone relies on that setup. Now picture this scenario. One day, your largest neighbor, the one running the most profitable operation in the area, the one who has been taking your printed cash for years, suddenly announces, "You know what? I do not want your cash anymore. I am going to rely on something different. I will rely on gold. I will rely on my own money. I will do business directly with other neighbors without involving you." That is basically what China has just done, and the results are truly massive. But to fully grasp why this is so significant, we need to look more closely at how this arrangement functions and why it cannot last forever. I have spent my career examining capitalism, its breakdowns, and its built-in problems, and I can tell you that the existing setup of the dollar as the global reserve currency is one of the greatest economic imbalances in recent history. It allows the United States, a nation that makes up less than 5% of the global population, to use close to 25% of the world's resources. How can this happen? Because the United States can pay for enormous trade shortfalls year after year, decade after decade, simply by printing more dollars or selling more dollar-based debt that other nations purchase. Consider it this way. If you and I spent more than we made every month, at some point our credit cards would hit their limits. Banks would refuse to lend to us and we would run into real money troubles. But the United States has been spending more than it makes for more than 40 straight years, building up massive trade gaps. And instead of facing quick consequences, the rest of the world has kept funding that way of life by purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds. China has traditionally been the biggest foreign purchaser of these bonds. At its highest point, China owned more than $1.3 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. That is $1.3 trillion. To give you some context, that is larger than the entire economic output of nations like Mexico or Indonesia. In reality, China was lending the United States extremely large sums of money, and the United States was using that borrowed cash to pay for its massive military network, to fund operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, to back tax reductions for wealthy individuals, and to give assistance to major companies. So the clear question becomes, why would China do this? Why would it bankroll its primary global rival? And this is where a lot of standard explanations come up short. They will tell you it was a win-win relationship where both sides benefited. The United States got affordable financing for its shortfalls. China got entry to a massive market for its products. Chinese workers made goods that American shoppers bought with borrowed funds. And that money came back to China as dollars that the Chinese government put into treasury bonds, a supposedly beneficial loop, they claim. But that explanation covers up an important power relationship. China did not have many real choices. When a nation runs very large trade gains with the United States, it builds up dollars, and those dollars need to go somewhere. You cannot just let them sit there doing nothing. You have to invest them. And for years, the biggest, most accessible, and seemingly most secure choice was U.S. Treasury bonds. It was the only market big enough to handle the enormous flows of dollars China was creating. However, there was a major weakness in this setup that China began to recognize more clearly as time went on. By keeping so much of its savings in U.S. Treasury bonds, China was putting itself heavily at the mercy of U.S. financial control. If Washington chose to lock those funds, China could lose access to more than $1 trillion of its national savings. If Washington chose to release very large amounts of new dollars through loose monetary approaches, the actual worth of China's holdings would shrink. If Washington decided to weaponize the financial system for political purposes, something it has done repeatedly with nations like Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and Afghanistan, China would be exposed. And here is the critical point I want you to take in. China observed very closely what the United States did to Russia after the fighting broke out in Ukraine in 2022. Washington locked up roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank savings. Read that once more. The United States and its partners effectively seized control of $300 billion in the foreign savings of another nation. Whatever your views on Russia or the conflict in Ukraine, this was a turning point in global financial history. It proved beyond any question that dollar-based holdings, even central bank savings that are meant to be protected within the global financial framework, can be locked, withheld, and used as a pressure tool if a nation goes against the interests of the United States. Now imagine yourself in the shoes of planners in Beijing. You own $800 billion, until recently more than $1 trillion, in U.S. Treasury bonds. You know the United States views you as its main strategic opponent. The Pentagon has openly named China as its top concern. The United States is forming military partnerships in Asia specifically to contain China's reach. It is placing tariffs on Chinese products, blocking technology sales to China, and constantly speaking about protecting Taiwan with armed forces. And at the same time, you have $1 trillion of your national savings and holdings that this same nation can freeze with a simple order. What would you do? The answer is clear. You would cut your exposure, spread out your holdings, and search for options. And that is precisely what China has been doing. Not in a hurried fashion, not in a messy fashion, but in an organized, purposeful, and deliberate manner. Information from the U.S. Treasury Department reveals this pattern very clearly. China has been offloading U.S. Treasury bonds steadily for years. From more than $1.3 trillion at its peak, it now owns less than $800 billion. That is a drop of over $500 billion. $500 billion. That is no longer backing the U.S. shortfall. $500 billion that China has moved into different holdings, different investments, and different ways of storing value. And China is not by itself in this. Japan, historically the second biggest owner of U.S. treasuries, is also cutting back its positions. Saudi Arabia, the nation that signed the oil for dollars deal with the United States in the 1970s, is spreading out its savings and is thinking about selling oil in yuan. Central banks across the globe are purchasing gold at levels not seen in many years. Russia has cut nearly all of its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. India is stacking up gold. Brazil is making trade deals in local currencies. The whole system that kept the dollar at the heart of world trade is gradually losing strength, and most people do not even realize it because major news outlets are too focused on covering what some official posted online or the newest celebrity drama. Now, let me respond early to the points from supporters of the current system. They will say, this does not matter. The United States will always locate buyers for its bonds. The dollar is too large to lose its standing. There is no real substitute. China would damage itself if it sold all its bonds because it would lower the worth of its own holdings. On the surface, these points might sound reasonable, but they break down with even basic examination. First, the statement that there is no substitute for the dollar. That was accurate 20 years ago. It is no longer accurate today. China has carefully constructed substitutes to the dollar-controlled system. It established CEPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, which is essentially its own version of SWIFT. SWIFT is the network that transfers money globally, and the United States has heavy influence over it and has used it as a method to enforce penalties on other nations. With CIPS, China can transfer money globally without depending on networks that Washington can directly watch or manage. China has also been actively pushing the use of the yuan in global trade. It has currency exchange deals with many nations. It is opening yuan processing centers in major cities worldwide. It is pricing more and more of its foreign commerce in yuan rather than dollars. And perhaps most significantly, it is supporting all of this with gold. China has been one of the top purchasers of gold in the world for years. It does not release precise numbers, and that is intentional from a strategic standpoint, but all estimates indicate it has built up thousands of tons of gold. Why gold? Because gold has a quality that U.S. Treasury bonds lack. It cannot be locked, it cannot be penalized, and it cannot be produced at will. It is genuine physical wealth that exists separately from any government's choices. If tomorrow the United States froze all Chinese dollar holdings, that gold would still maintain its worth. It is the ultimate form of defense against U.S. financial strength. Second, the point that China would harm itself by selling its bonds mixes up short-term moves with long-term planning. Yes, if China unloaded all its bonds at once, prices would drop and the worth of its own holdings would decrease. It would be like attempting to sell 100,000 shares of a business at the same moment. You would overwhelm the market and the price would crash, but that is not what China is doing. It is selling step by step and consistently over many years. It is lowering risk without triggering alarm in the market. It is the difference between rushing out of a building on fire and disorder and leaving in an organized manner. You reach the same result, getting out, but with much less harm. And here is the deeper reality that many dollar supporters would rather not recognize. China can afford to take some hits on its treasury holdings if that means staying out of a much bigger strategic trap. Look at it this way. If you have $1 million put into something you believe will eventually lose worth, would you rather sell now for $800,000 or wait and risk losing far more down the road? China is making the strategic judgment that it is wiser to take managed losses now than to stay completely exposed in the time ahead. But the largest issue for the United States is not simply that China is selling bonds. The true issue is that the United States needs purchasers more than ever. Examine U.S. budget shortfalls in recent years. They are enormous, trillions of dollars every year. Interest charges on the current national debt alone now go beyond $600 billion every year. And that figure keeps climbing as interest rates go up. The United States is stuck in a debt spiral. It has to borrow more each year just to cover interest on what it already owes, on top of paying for regular government operations. And if usual, foreign purchasers, China, Japan, and oil-producing nations are cutting back their buying, then someone else has to make up that difference. So who purchases the bonds when foreign buyers pull back? The Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank. And when a central bank purchases government debt, there is a technical name for that: debt monetization. In plain terms, it means the government is generating money to pay for itself. And this is exactly what we witnessed during the pandemic. This occurred on a level never witnessed before. The Federal Reserve actually purchased trillions of dollars in Treasury bonds. It grew its balance sheet from under $4 trillion before the pandemic to above $9 trillion at its highest point. That is more than $5 trillion generated from nothing and used to purchase government debt. And what was the outcome? The worst inflation in 40 years. Food costs went up by 20, 30, even 40%. Gas costs jumped. Rent prices climbed. Actual wages dropped because pay raises could not match rising costs. Working families got hurt while asset holders, individuals with stocks and property, got wealthier because all that money generation drove asset values higher. This is what I call the class impact of monetary policy. When the Fed generates money, it does not touch everyone the same way. It strongly helps individuals who hold financial assets. It hurts individuals who depend on paychecks and whose savings lose purchasing power. So when people ask me, why is this important? Why should you be concerned that China is selling treasury bonds? Here is the response. It creates an impossible numbers problem for the United States. Either the U.S. government slashes spending dramatically, which is politically unrealistic, or the Fed keeps generating money to purchase debt that nobody else wants. That means higher inflation, which means your money purchases less, which means your quality of life drops. There is no simple escape from this contradiction. It is the unavoidable outcome of many years of spending beyond our means, of paying for overseas conflicts with debt, of lowering taxes for the wealthy while growing military spending, of rescuing banks and big businesses while letting public works decline. This is the long-term price of those decisions now coming into focus. And let me be direct about something else. This is not merely figures on a document. This is about control. The dollar-based system has been the foundation of U.S. worldwide influence for more than 50 years. It has enabled the United States to operate hundreds of military bases overseas. It has enabled the U.S. to place financial restrictions on nations it disagrees with by removing them from the worldwide financial network. It has enabled the U.S. to maintain a military budget bigger than the next 10 nations combined. All of this rests on the special standing of the dollar. And if that standing gets weaker, the whole structure of U.S. influence begins to tremble. Now, let me respond to another point I encounter regularly. People say China has its own troubles. Its housing market is stressed, its population is getting older, its economic expansion is slowing. They say China cannot really stand up to the United States. All of that is accurate. China definitely has major structural challenges. But this is not about China being flawless or China taking over from the United States. This is about the world no longer wanting to place all its resources in the dollar container. It is about spreading out. It is about having alternatives. For the first time in 50 years, nations have genuine choices about where to keep their savings, which currency to use for commerce, and how to shield themselves from financial chaos, and they are taking those choices. Consider the expansion of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These nations now account for a bigger portion of the world economy than the G7. They are actively talking about forming a shared trading currency among themselves. They are building development banks that compete with Western-run organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. Saudi Arabia, the most crucial U.S. partner in the Middle East for many years, is talking about joining BRICS. They are considering selling oil in yuan. 10 years ago, this would have been hard to imagine. The petrodollar arrangement, where oil is traded only in dollars, has been a key support for dollar power. If major oil sellers start taking other currencies, that support gets weaker. And it is not only BRICS. Nations around the world are signing direct exchange deals to trade in local currencies. Argentina and Brazil trade in their own currencies. India and Russia trade in rupees and rubles. China and Saudi Arabia are discussing commerce in yuan. Each of these arrangements is modest by itself, but combined, they show a major direction: the gradual shift away from dollar-based commerce. And central banks are demonstrating their preferences through their behavior. Data from the International Monetary Fund shows the dollar's portion of world savings has dropped from above 70% 2 decades ago to around 58% now. That is a meaningful decline, and gold, as noted earlier, is being collected at record levels. Central banks bought more than 1,000 tons of gold last year alone. They are shifting wealth away from U.S.-backed paper holdings into physical assets that cannot be easily locked or limited. So the question confronting the United States is essential. How do you keep the dollar's special standing when the world no longer wants to give it so easily? And this is where the choices become very limited and very risky. Option one is that the United States accepts a multi-currency world where the dollar stays relevant but no longer dominant. This would need humility. It would need reforming global financial bodies to give developing nations more say. It would need accepting boundaries on U.S. authority based on history and current politics. This appears very unlikely. U.S. leadership is not ready to surrender this benefit voluntarily. Option two is that the United States attempts to force the world to continue using the dollar through pressure, more penalties, more pressure on partners, possibly even direct moves to control strategic resources or trade paths. This is risky because it turns an economic shift into global conflict. And honestly, based on recent history in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, this is a choice U.S. leaders would seriously think about. Option three is that the United States continues on its current path, generating more money to cover shortfalls, stacking up more debt, and eventually hitting a budget crisis where bond markets lock up, interest rates jump, and the economy falls into a severe decline. This is the rough landing scenario, and every year that goes by without meaningful reform makes it more probable. Option four, and I believe this is the most probable, is gradual splitting apart. The worldwide system breaks into currency groups: a dollar group led by the United States and its nearest partners, a yuan group centered on China and its trading partners, possibly other regional groups as well. The world becomes more unstable, more uncertain, more likely to experience friction. But there is no single dramatic crash, just a steady wearing away of the previous order. And this brings us back to China selling U.S. bonds. What China did was not a one-time action. It was a message. It was proof that they have alternatives, that they are no longer trapped in the dollar system, that they can shield their national savings from what they view as risky monetary choices in Washington. And that message is being clearly received in capitals worldwide. Other nations are watching this. They observe that China can do this. They observe that there is existence beyond the dollar. They observe that the appearance of complete U.S. financial control may not be as strong as it once appeared. And once that view spreads, the process builds on itself. More nations sell bonds, which pushes interest rates higher. That makes it costlier for the United States to fund its debt, which leads to more money generation, which drives more inflation, which further damages confidence in the dollar, which leads to more bond selling. It is a destructive loop, the exact reverse of the positive pattern that kept the dollar at the top for many years. So what does all of this mean for you, the regular person viewing this? It means the world you were raised in, the world where the United States made the rules, where the dollar was supreme, where we could use more than we made without obvious consequences. That world is disappearing. And that will have actual effects on your daily existence. If the dollar drops in value, foreign goods become pricier. That means higher costs for nearly everything from electronics to clothing to food. If the United States needs to pay higher interest on its debt, there is less funding for everything else: education, roads and bridges, public programs. If we hit a budget crisis, we could witness deep reductions to programs that millions of people count on. If the world economy splits up, you may experience supply chain problems, product shortages, and job losses in fields connected to global commerce. None of this is distant. None of this is just economic ideas. This touches your ability to cover rent, to purchase groceries, to prepare for what comes next. And what bothers me most is that none of this was impossible to predict. Critical economists like me have been sounding alarms about these contradictions for many years. We have been highlighting that you cannot pay for an empire with borrowed money forever. The era of easy money and unquestioned dominance is closing, and the bill is finally coming due. Does your current financial plan account for a world where the dollar isn't the only game in town? If you found this analysis helpful, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below to keep the conversation going.